First of all, I would like to welcome all of the listeners today to this webinar because we have a very interesting turnout. It seems that this webinar topic is of great interest to many people. It's also of great importance to us because we at KPI have been accustomed to practicing the traditional business rules approach in much the same way that all of you have been doing. And in fact, we even wrote a book called Business Rules Applied, published by Wiley, about how to do that. But we became frustrated, and I presume that many of you have become frustrated, with some of the limitations of capturing individual business rules following a traditional business rules approach. And one of the major frustrations is the accurate perception by many people, including business people and IT people, that it takes too long to carry out the traditional business rules approach. Now, in spite of that, we of course have always believed that business rules remain the most important aspect perhaps of a business or a system. So rather than abandon the business rules approach or just try to convince people to keep on doing it even though it takes a long time, we decided that we needed to rethink the challenges of business rule management so that we can deliver more value in doing so in less time and with higher quality. And that was the goal that we set for ourselves when we came up with the decision model. And we are happy to say that that goal has been achieved over and over since the publication of the book in 2009 with some great successes. So the most important part about this webinar is in its title. The title is the 5 most important differences between the decision model and the business rules approaches that you folks are probably familiar with. But the most important part of the title is that these differences are not by accident. We created these differences between the decision model and what you're doing today on purpose. And we believe that those differences signal an evolutionary step forward for both businesses and their systems when it comes to what we used to call business rules, but today we're going to call decision management and decision modeling. So first of all, I want to cover the common hurdles that many of us have faced when we're carrying out the business rules approach. And these hurdles are ones that many of our clients have experienced and many of you have experienced. Typically when we do this in a face-to-face presentation, we do this as an interactive exercise. And by that I mean we ask people some of the common hurdles that they have come across, and then we come back and readdress them at the end. But in a webinar, of course, we can't do the interaction, so I'm going to summarize for you the common hurdles that we faced and we have heard, and hopefully they will sound familiar to you. But before we look at the hurdles, I just want to take a step backwards and classify the current business rules approaches into 3 different categories that we see on the marketplace. The first category are those approaches that arise from commercial business engine software vendors. And these particular approaches are tailored to the target technology, whether that be iLog or Jules or Blaze or Corticon or some other technology. The second category are those developed by consultants or consulting companies. And the good news about these is they tend to be technology independent and not so targeted at a particular methodology. They do, however, reflect the style or the preference of the consultant or the company, and so they have slight differences among them. The third category is actually more popular than I believed until recently in our experience in introducing the decision model. The third category are those business rules approaches that are developed by corporations themselves because they need to create a customized business rule management approach that reflects the complexity of their own kinds of business rules. And so we have 3 different kinds of business rules approaches on the market today. But what's important to this webinar and to most of you is that all of these business rules approaches, including the one we wrote that book about, seem to share some common core practices. And that's a good thing, except that it is some of these common core practices that are actually getting in the way of our success with our business rules approaches. So on this page, we have the 3 notable common business rules approaches, or the pieces that they all have in common. So the first one, or the first bullet, indicates that all of these approaches usually require you to translate business statements or policies or conversations or procedure manuals into another more standardized form. And each business rules approach adopts its own standardized form and the way they write statements, which may be free-form text or rigorous grammar such as SBVR, or various ways of representing rules such as decision tables or decision trees, or some combination of all of these. So almost all the approaches do these. The second bullet indicates that each of these business rule approaches also usually works with software that allows you to capture the business rules that you've translated and manage them over time. For the business rule approaches that come from the business rule engine vendors, usually the software is a proprietary front end that is meant to integrate with the target engine. For approaches that come from consultants or consulting companies who want to be technology independent on the automation side, they may supply their own business rule repository or have a favorite one that's out there. And then for those business rules approaches that originate from within a corporation, a lot of those companies create their own homegrown software. And in fact, in one of our other books, The Business Rule Revolution, we highlighted a healthcare insurance company that had built a very sophisticated front end for capturing and managing their business rules. And the third bullet indicates that each of these approaches has something else in common. Most of them require you to develop a data-centric model as a reference point for writing your rules. So in some approaches, this model is a logical data model. In some of them, it's a physical database design. Another one, it might be a business-friendly object model. Or in some of them, it's a new kind of model or a different kind of model called a fact model. One of the parts of these approaches and these data-centric models is that you either have to already have those models or develop them at the same time, because when you translate your business statements and business policies into your business rule standard approach, you're supposed to reference the terms and the facts or the data attributes as they appear in those data-centric models. So in other words, you are unable to translate the common conversations into business rules without having a data-centric model to use as a reference point. And that's common in almost all of the business rules approaches. So let's take a look at the common hurdles that we find when we carry out any of these approaches, and because all of them have those three common practices. And this is what people have told us. Some people say it takes too long to translate original business thoughts into a standard form, and not only that, it's usually less intuitive, even if it is more precise, but it takes too long. The second is that the data-centric models become bottlenecks because they slow down the capturing of the rules. So as we change those models and make sure we have them correct. The third one is that there's no science to estimating how long it's going to take you to capture your business rules for a certain scope. And number four is, therefore, in the same vein, it seems like there's no way to know when you're finished or how far along you are in your progress. Number five, even though capturing the business rules and business rules approaches separates them from all other aspects of a system or a process, the process models somehow still remain complex. And that doesn't seem like what should happen. They should become simpler if we pull the business rules out. And this is actually a symptom of a much bigger problem, is how do we, if you will, with rigor, relate individual business rules to other kinds of models in our architecture. And there's no common way to do that today. Number six, the individual business rule, or even lists of them, does not get high management attention. They just seem like too detailed level of requirements, and high management does not pay a lot of attention to them. Seven is, despite our good intentions, we want to capture all of the business rules during requirements or analysis. But probably almost every single time, most of you will say that you continue to capture business rules during design, during development, and sometimes even when testing is going on. And that's usually because we run out of time or money, not because we plan on doing it that way. And number eight, we like to think that putting business rules into a business rule management system or an engine means that we have successfully separated them for easy maintenance. But here's what we learned, and probably you know this too. Typically, even when you use a commercial engine, the business rules are no longer in a form in that engine that is understandable to the business people you started with. Even if you try to keep a cross-reference from what they said to what's in the technology, or if you try to use the user-friendly front ends to these technologies, it just falls apart because there are two different representations, and there's no, there's just not a consistent management, integrated way of managing them. And oftentimes we get called in specifically to try to understand what the rules are that an organization has put into an engine maybe 1 or 2 years ago, and try to pull them out in a way that the business people can say, oh, that's what it's doing. And that is a lot of time and a lot of effort, which results in number 9, where there's still a gap between business and IT in all of the business rules approaches that we have seen, and that gap has not been closing for a long time now. So the good news is that the decision model, again, is aiming to reduce those hurdles, or at least minimize them, so we can be a lot more effective, we can be a lot more successful, and we can keep the attention of the business people on the governance of their business rules. So what I'm going to do is spend a few moments on very basics of the decision model. And the reason I'm doing this is I think when I looked at the list of attendees, I saw that about half of you are familiar with the decision model and about half of you are not. So I'm going to do it quickly. For more in-depth, you're invited to purchase the book called The Decision Model to learn the details. But I want to go over it quickly because what I really want to do is the next step. I want to create a decision model with you. Today, we'll create little pieces of a decision model so you can see exactly how we work and exactly how it gets built, and then it won't seem so foreign to you. So the title of this page is Separation of Concerns, and it was something that was advocated by Ken Orr. Ken Orr is a well-known enterprise architect, and he has said that over time we have separated major dimensions from our systems so that we can develop them and maintain them separately. So the one I'm most familiar with is the data dimension. And how did we separate the data dimension from the process dimension in the past, in the 70s? Well, we're able to do that because we have one kind of model to represent the process model and another model to represent the data model. So in other words, we have a data model and a process model. They're not the same model, and we don't mix process and data in the same model. And today we have many different models for the different aspects of the systems and businesses, but we have one particular dimension for which we have no model and until the decision model, and that is the business rule dimension. But we rename the business rule dimension as the business logic dimension, and I'll explain to you why that is. It's an important distinction, but we're essentially talking about the same area of a process or a business. We're just recasting it with a different representation. So let's see first, if you are like we were, if you are successfully or partly successfully separating the business rules from all these other components in your system or business, let's see how that's working for you today. Okay, some of you may have seen this process model before. I believe it's in our book, and this is actually from a real client. And they follow the best practices for business rules, which means the business rules are not in this model. This is supposedly purely process. Like many organizations, they put identifiers in the model as those little red numbers in there that point to the individual business rules themselves. The business rules themselves are separated someplace else, in a business rule repository, in a rule book, maybe in a requirements tool or a homegrown database, but the rules, the words of the rules are not in this process model anywhere. Now, even though you can't read this process model, you probably can appreciate the nature of it. And I suspect that it looks probably much like ones you have seen or even created. And just so you folks can feel comfortable, we have done exactly the same thing. So in the spirit of full disclosure, this is not a criticism of anybody or of any approach. It's what we all were doing, and it was the best at the time. But it turns out that this way of separating business rules has flaws, and such that they quickly become unmanageable over time, no matter how diligently we try to capture them and separate them. And that was the case for this project. So the organization did list them and group them in a catalog. They didn't group them in any particular way or different ways. There was no diagram for them. And the shortcoming was that the groups of business rules were grouped according to the task that was using them, so the groups were not necessarily reusable from one process to another or from one project to another. And the truth is, there's simply no way to pull all the business rules out of a process model like this, because since we don't have a specific representation for the rules themselves, some of them are actually disguised as process tasks. So we kind of have a hybrid model here, and that happens all the time. But if we sit back and think about this, this is eerily similar to the way we managed data just a few decades ago. We used to create lists of data elements and put them in a data dictionary or a data catalog. But guess what? That didn't work too well either. When the relational model was introduced, that was when we were able to purely separate the data and create reusable, common look and feel databases that we could use across enterprises and standardize and move into the information age. And the relational model still serves as the superior way to manage data. So we decided that we can learn from this historic lesson. There was a lot to learn, and there were a lot of similarities. So this page shows you how much simpler the previous process model becomes when we re-engineer it to reference entire decision models instead of those little pointers pointing to individual business rules or groups of business rules. Without knowing anything else, you can see that we have reduced the process model to fewer task boxes, and even the pointers to the business rules are all gone. One of the benefits of this is the process models become more generic, because sometimes the difference from one process model to another is just simply the set of rules that you execute depending upon which transaction is going through the process. So that's an added benefit that we hadn't counted on. But you're probably saying, well, that all sounds very good, but where did the business rules go and what do they look like? So you know already from this presentation that they are in a different kind of model. And now I'm going to tell you that the model is specific to the nature of the logic behind the business rules. So let's look at this page carefully. If you look at the process model on the left of the page, you will see two pale blue octagons in two of the orange task boxes. They probably look like circles to you, but they're really octagons. And these octagons indicate that these particular tasks are powered by a decision model. So if you follow one of those arrows that goes from the process model to near the center of the page, they point to a new kind of model with the blue octagon at the top and then green tablet-like shapes under it. These are decision model diagrams, and each of these green icons is called a rule family. And behind one of those rule families, if you were to click on one, so we see one in the middle that says policy renewal method, policy pricing within bounds, etc. If you were to click on that, you would get the two-dimensional table to its right. And what's in that two-dimensional table are conditions leading to one conclusion. And so it's basically like a sophisticated truth table or a decision table, but it's got a lot more rigor and constraints on it so that there's only one way to create it. And so that's where the logic of the individual business rules is actually found within those tables, but those tables are now connected to each other in a very natural way, which I'm going to show you. So let's move on, and with the understanding that we call the dimension that we are modeling the business logic dimension, not the business rule dimension, because it is simply a model of business rules that are now expressed as business logic. And business logic, as defined on this page, is simply the means by which a business derives conclusions that are important to it from conditions, because that's the only thing that logic means is conditions leading to conclusions. And we call it business logic because it is the business's logic. It's the logic that business people, such as vice presidents, underwriters, credit managers, risk managers, it's the logic that they want to manage that runs in our systems or behind our processes. The simplest kind of business logic is an expression that evaluates only one condition and determines the value of only one conclusion. And this page contains a very simple example like that. In this example, the condition on the left is simply comparing a person's credit rating as being less than 650. So it's either less than or it's not. And if it is, then the conclusion is that that person's likelihood of defaulting on a loan is high. And we say that because this is something that a business person has told us. They have told us this is how the business wants to come to this conclusion. They're going to look at credit rating, nothing else, and they're going to come to this conclusion. But in order for us to have a rigorous model, we need it to be universal. This means there must be one and only one way for anyone to create such a model for any set of conditions leading to conclusions. In other words, our goal was that every decision modeler sitting down and looking at the same input statements would create exactly the same or very significantly similar models, just as we do with data. We want to leave very little to the creative minds very little to preference, but we want to add a science so that it's more or less, not so much just step by step, but more or less the same results because it has restrictions and conditions, if you will, or theory that sits behind it and tells you exactly how you're supposed to reorganize these conditions into conclusions. In order to do that, we needed to define, or we needed to realize we have to take business logic and all of those statements, we have to break them into their smallest pieces, which are called atomic pieces. And that's because if all of you folks, and there are hundreds of you hopefully right now listening to this webinar, if all of you were looking at the same statements and you all broke them into the same little atomic pieces, and then you followed the theory of the decision model to put those pieces back in a correct way, you would all come up with something very similar. And that means that you can critique each other's models, you can understand anybody else's models. It also means that software can be created that can validate the integrity of the models because they will always have the same look and feel. And that's what we set out to do with the decision model, which is not so far from what Dr. Codd set out to do with the relational model. So what do we mean by taking a statement of logic and turning it into its most atomic pieces? Well, there are only 4 things you need to know about what it means to be atomic. And those 4 things are on this page. So what we say is for the decision model, we are going to work with atomic pieces that look like this. There is one and only one conclusion column. It says conclusion fact type, but there's going to be only one conclusion column in each one of those 2-dimensional tables. We are not going to allow multiple conclusions. I know you may not totally understand that right now, but it's kind of like having a primary key in a relational database. You can only have one. And you can create as many conditions as the business needs, but when you fill in the rows, the 3rd bullet says all of those rows are ANDed together to result in the corresponding conclusion. And most importantly, we don't allow ors, or else's, or buts, or otherwises. First of all, these are the things that have created a lot of chaos in our current systems, and maintenance becomes a problem. But more interesting is that if we allowed all of those things, each of you might go and create your tables in a different way. Some of you would use else's, some of you would use otherwises, some of you would use ors and ands, and you would not come out with exactly the same structure. And that would defeat the whole purpose of rigor and science, if you will. So let's take a look at what a rule family looks like when we put these atomic pieces together. This page contains a statement at the top of about conditions leading to conclusions. It says a person who has a credit score below 650 and also has an unstable employment history and also has a high other loans assessment, whatever that is, if those 3 things are true, they're highly likely to default on the loan. So you can see that we have the condition columns and one conclusion column. We have to name each of those columns, and then we fill in a row. So here we have a person's credit score is less than 650 and their employment history is unstable and their person's other loan assessment is high. Then our conclusion is that their likelihood of defaulting a loan is also high. So once we fill in a row like that, we start to ask some questions. We'll look at the first condition and say, where do we get a person's credit score to compare against the 650? In most cases, in most organizations, they would say they go to an outside credit agency and they just receive the person's credit score as input data. If we're just receiving a piece of data, then there's nothing to be done with that, right? We're done with that condition. We move to the next one and we say, okay, well, where do we get the person's employment history to compare it to the concept of unstable? Does it come to us as raw data? Does someone fill out an application and simply check off unstable on their application? And it turns out, of course, that this is not what happens. What happens is that this particular organization says, no, no, no. Unstable is the way we are going to judge their employment history. We are going to look at things like how long they've worked at their current employer, how many jobs they've had, and those kinds of things in order to determine for ourselves whether their employment history is unstable in our opinion. And so what do? Well, there's only one answer. We simply create another rule family whose one conclusion column is person employment history. We can add the conditions to that column, person years at current employer, person number of jobs in the past 5 years, or whatever the conditions are. And now we have another rule family. But what's Most interesting here is there is a relationship that starts to appear between person employment history in the top rule family and person employment history in the bottom rule family. One is related to the other. So what happens is that we take a look at the top two conditions to determine person's employment history as a conclusion, and that person's employment history serves as a condition in yet another rule family. And in those decision models that you saw when we showed you how the process model became simpler and we created those green tabular icons and they were connected with arrows or with lines, these are the lines that you saw in those models. So we start to build a decision model diagram like the one you kind of saw. You couldn't read it. We put the octagon on the top. We have a tablet for policy renewal method being the words at the top of that tablet represent the conclusion column heading, and then you have the three below it, policy pricing within bounds, policy underwriting risk, and manual underwriting indicator are the condition columns. So if you were to click on that top box, you would see the two-dimensional table right here that has those three conditions and the conclusion. So you could have thousands of rows in this table depending on what your logic is. Now as far as the conditions, you'll notice that two of them are between the solid line and the dotted line. That's policy pricing within bounds and policy underwriting risk. And one of them is under the dotted line. The one under the dotted line is one that comes to us as raw data. There's nothing to be done with it. But the ones between the solid line and the dotted line, those have rule families in which those particular conditions are actually the conclusions. So we know in this case we're going to have two dependent rule families, one for policy pricing within bounds, which you see on the left-hand side, and there will also be one for policy underwriting risk. And you see on the left-hand side of the screen the policy pricing within bounds, that's the conclusion column, and we have two conditions in there, and policy discount is going to have its own dependent rule family because it's actually a conclusion in another table. And that's simply how you interpret a decision model diagram and how you read the rule families for it. And this is what a decision model looks like when it's finished. So I already said that the conditions that are in the green tablets or in the rule families that are below the solid line, below the dotted line, those are the ones that come to us as raw data. So notice in this particular diagram, we've gotten three levels of rule families, and the bottom level has all of its conditions below the dotted line. That simply tells you you are finished. You don't have any conditions between the solid and the dotted line, so we don't need to create any more dependent rule families. We are finished. Another point to think about is if we were to deliver this as a service, the determined policy renewal method service, the service would simply obtain as input all of the values that are underneath the dotted line in all of these rule families. So it would need to have the manual underwriting indicator, the policy tier, the policy grade, package discount. Those are all the things you would feed into this decision model service, and out of it would come the policy renewal method. So I hope you're beginning to see that a decision model fills a gap. It's its own model right now. It has a recognizable structure which is not the same as the structure of any of your data models or an object model or a fact model or a process model, but it has a structure of logic, of conditions leading to conclusions. So it's very pure, it's very separate, and it's totally technology independent. This does not require a business rule engine. You can code Java if you like. You can do it manually if you like. It is not tied to any particular technology, and we believe it will stand the test of time, just as the relational model has done. So now let's go ahead and actually create a decision model. And we're going to do it from something that you can look at on the web, a set of requirements. And we're going to create one rule family, and then we're going to show you how it relates to all the other rule families in a decision model. So this is actually 7 statements. This is in the state of New Jersey, which is where I live, and many other places, they have probationary driver licenses. This is a driver license that is given to a brand new driver for a certain amount of time. And so they have, it's about a year I think, they have to meet these 7 requirements for that time frame that are more restrictive than someone who doesn't have a learner's or probationary driver's license. So obviously here they have to have a decal. The number 1 says decal. Number 2, they can't drive after 11 o'clock at night and before 5 in the morning. And there are 7 requirements that they must follow. But number 3 is interesting. We're going to take a look at that one. Number 3 says, a driver with a probationary license must be accompanied in the front seat by an adult supervising driver who has at least 21 years of age and who possesses a valid New Jersey driver's license and has a minimum of 3 years of driving experience. So what are we going to do with that? Well, here's that same statement put up on the top there, and at first glance it looks like we have 3 conditions. We have the fact that the passenger in the front seat has to have a certain age. They have to have a valid New Jersey license, and they have to have 3 years of experience. So the first thing we do is name our column headings. Our conclusion is the front seat passenger compliance, whether the front seat passenger is in compliance with this license. And then we have their age, their license type. And it turns out in this case, we added license type because we started asking the, let's say the policeman or the policewoman, can the driver in the passenger seat have a probationary license? And the answer is, oh no, they have to have, a regular license, a basic license. So we had to add a column that isn't in the original statement. And by the way, that happens all the time, of course, as you know, if you've done business rules, is you read a statement and there are things implied in the statement that you have to pull out. So basically when we do that, we say, here's our first row. We have a front seat passenger age if it's greater than or equal to 21, and they have a basic driver's license, not a probationary one, and it's valid, which by itself I don't know what that means. I suppose it means it's not expired, but maybe it means other things, like it's not suspended. We may have a dependent rule family for that one, but right now we don't. And they have more than or equal to 3 years of experience, then they are compliant. And it's as simple as that. But this example, like most examples, hasn't told us the rest of the story. They've just told us the happy path in terms of what it is for the front seat passenger to be compliant. So we have to come up with the things that are not compliant. So if you look at this page, we have row 2 says if the passenger seat, the front seat passenger age is less than 21, we don't even care about the other 3 conditions. They are not in compliance. And if they have something other than a basic driver license type, they're not in compliance. I don't care if they're 26 years old or 99 years old. So we have to put each one of those conditions, if they're not true, that we're not compliant. There's another column here called rule pattern. Rule pattern simply indicates which cells are filled in. So if we had another row that had the first condition column filled in but none of the others, it would be a rule pattern 2. We're not going to go into rule patterns in this presentation, but they are very helpful in looking for errors in the logic. So far you've seen how we created one rule family. We read a sentence, we dissected it into its conditions leading to a conclusion, we put in a column headings, and we filled in the row. But that was only one of 7 requirements. So we have to deal with all 7. If we do create just a rule family for one of them, but we actually want a decision model that tells us whether the driver is in compliance with a probationary driver license. Suppose we've stopped a driver on the road. We have to create rule families for all of the others. But we can do it from a top-down perspective. So in this example, what we've done is we have the determined probationary driver compliance in the octagon. We have the rule family that has the probationary driver compliance as the conclusion, and we can start to put in the conditions that come to us as raw data, like the driving hours that they're in right now and whether they have their seatbelts on or not. And the other ones we put between the solid line and the dotted line, and those are going to have their own dependent rule families. So we start to play with this, and we start to fill in the tables, and as we fill in the tables, we change our diagram. And here's what the diagram may look like when we're finished. And you'll notice too, in this case, the bottom level, all the conditions are below the dotted line. So we are finished with this decision model. This is usually where, if I'm speaking face to face, someone says, well, how big are these really? But this is a real one. If you were really doing this in real life, this is a real one that I just pulled off the web. But in reality, even in corporations with complex logic, most of the decision models fit on 1 to 2 pages. Only rarely do they go much bigger than that. So what happens is you're dissecting the logic into smaller pieces called rule families. And when you do that, you don't end up with so many of them. They're much simpler than not breaking them up. They're very simple to read and to understand, but they're much smaller. So now that you understand how to create a rule family and how to interpret a rule decision model diagram that has all of its rule families together, I want to point out to you the 5 important differences in doing what I just did compared to what you're doing today. And the first one is that the decision model is built around the notion of a decision and not around the notion of a business rule. So it is dealing with business rules, but it's not all about the rules. It's about something bigger. The decision is something bigger and of more importance to the business than individual business rules. For example, the one you just saw was whether a driver was compliant with their probationary license. This is for new drivers. So that has a lot of business significance. You look at that model and look at how many accidents are occurring with new drivers. And if you see that there are certain things that are common to those accidents, you can build in the logic to reduce those number of accidents. So, for example, in our case, we're starting to see, since we've restricted the the device usage and the passengers and things like that, that we start to see that the accidents that do happen usually happen in the snow and the ice. But do you notice in our decision model, we did not have any restrictions on that driver in the snow and the ice. So now we're able to go back in there and let's do that and restrict them in terms of those situations in order to reduce the number of injuries and accidents. And so the notion of decision gets management attention. As the description of these different states, the formal notion of decision behind the decision model elevates the practice of business rule management to the more strategic practice of business decision management. And what that means is the importance is it shifts the focus when you're working with business people. You don't spend a lot of time on how best to express the business rule and what noun to use and what verb to use. You spend time evaluating the impact of the logic actually on the business. Is this the right logic? Are these the right conditions? And then you measure it to see how well it's doing. And that is a significant maturity level in terms of managing the logic and the rules. So this brings a solid business focus by business people to the creation and management of decision models that is more successful than just the listing and expressing of business rules. The second difference, of course, is the nature of the fact that we now have a formal model and not simply a list of business rules or various options, decision trees, decision tables, etc. The description here states that the decision model has a theoretical foundation of 15 principles that govern its integrity, and those are in the book. We're not going to go through those here, but it means that any decision model adhering to all 15 principles is operating at the highest level of integrity and is devoid of errors, inconsistencies, and redundancies. And why is this important in the third column? Because it gives a well-defined structure of the business rules and logic along with integrity principles, which is exactly what the relational model brought to the field of data management. And the relational model, in that way, took data management out of the dark ages and into the information age. And we believe the decision model is going to do the same thing in the business rule space, take us out of the business rule age and into the decision management age. The third difference is one we didn't anticipate, but it turned out to be very useful, and this is model-based functionality. The description here says that as a holistic model, a decision model lends itself to model-oriented functionality that isn't possible if you're dealing with just individual business rules or lists. And these include things like, in the importance column there, the ability to cut and copy and paste models and compare models and version them and customize them. And these are far more mature functionalities than we can do today with just lists of business rules. And they are functionalities that business people are very comfortable with. So if you can give them a tool where they can create a model and cut and paste and change, copy one and change a few things in it for a different perspective, they're very good with that. The fourth difference is the inspiration for new software innovation. Now, it's true that business rules approaches today use various types of business rule software. On the automation side, we have business rule engines. We have the Reedy engines, if you're familiar with them. We have engines that are not Reedy based. But the truth of the matter is, none of these technologies have changed significantly in the last few decades. And even the business rule repository front ends that are out there, they really haven't changed very much, if you can think of the last major change. So the description here for this difference is that new software innovations are now possible. Just think about what we just said about copies and pasting and versioning. In much the same way that the relational model led to sophisticated relational products, and that could not have existed before. So the importance in here says decision modeling capability is appearing in modeling and requirements tools, but more importantly in a new generation of software which is called a BDMS, or Business Decision Management System. The first one on the marketplace today, and we have worked with them, is Sapiens' product called Decision. And products like that go well beyond the management of business rules. So let me take a minute or so to explain it. A BDMS is not just a modeling tool for creating and changing decision models, because it supports a customized workflow that allows business people and IT people to work side by side in creating decision models, in automatically validating whole decision models against all 15 principles at the push of a button. If you remember what I said about that, if a decision model adheres to all 15 principles, there are no redundancies, no overlaps, no inconsistencies, so it's at a very high level of integrity. A BDMS can also automatically generate test cases for an entire decision model, and it can actually run those test cases in an internal engine. And what this means is you don't need to deploy your decision model in your target environment in order to test it. You can do it with a BDMS without deploying it at all. And then the last thing that it can do is, depending on the BDMS, but the one I'm talking about here is capable of, it has adapters for deploying a decision model to specific target environments. So today Sapiens has adapters, I believe, for Drools and for iLog, and it has been deployed at a homegrown engine, and we know clients who have deployed decision models in Corticon. What that means is you can have a decision model and you can deploy it in multiple environments just to test out and see which one is better, or to move it from one environment to another. But the point of reference remains the decision model, technology independent in the BDMS. And so these are groundbreaking capabilities that are not available without the decision model or without decision model supporting the software. And this brings us to our last difference, which is to focus on the pure audience, business audience. The second column here explains that the decision model is the first approach designed from the pure business perspective and encompassing the need for full lifecycle governance. We tested the decision model at client sites before we published our book, working with people like claims processors in insurance, risk managers and credit managers in mortgage, in different industries, so that we felt comfortable that the decision model is usable by business people and it does not contain any IT-related things that the business people don't need to worry about. So we had two goals: to make it rigorous and to make it business-friendly. And for example, in order to create a decision model, whether you're just using Visio and Excel or Sapiens Decision, does not require any data-centric models in order to create a decision model. You only need to create a business glossary, no models whatsoever. Of course, if you're going to automate it in a target environment, you will need models, but we don't need to bother the business people with it. So let me wrap up real quickly. The advantages of the decision model are on this page, but I want you to realize that you can gain all of these advantages without buying any technology. So these are the advantages. There's only one representation for business logic, and it has been applied to almost every kind of complexity of rules. There's no translation into special grammar or templates. There are no data-centric models. And decision models can be created top-down, doing the diagram into the rule families, or bottom-up, or any combination. The scope of each decision model is quite small compared to the scope of a whole project. It's easy to make changes to any decision model because normalization and the principles means there's one and only one place to make a change. They are easily automated in today's and future technology because they are technology independent. And you can create different views for the same decision model simply by making little changes, and that maximizes the reuse and minimizes the rework. If, on the other hand, you decide to use a BDMS, you have even more advantages. First, the BDMS can capture statistics about a decision model in terms of how many rule families are expected, conditions and conclusions, inversions, And this can allow it to have an algorithm inside the BDMS that can estimate how long it's going to take you to make a change or to create that decision model. A BDMS can test a decision model with its own internal engine, which means you don't have to deploy and go through your IT folks. Adapters allow for deployment with very little IT intervention. Customized workflows bring business and IT to the same software. And then, of course, the automated detection of logic errors is instantaneous, long before you ever test anything. You know that your decision model is high quality. And test cases can be generated automatically unless you want to create your own. What this means is these advantages, by the time a business person or a business analyst turns a decision model over to IT for production employment, that decision model is already free of errors and has been completely tested, and therefore it's higher quality, and that means faster deployment because it's already whole with no errors. So let me just go back to my last page here, one more page after this. What about the hurdles we started with? Well, you already saw how long it takes to translate statements into a decision model diagram or a rule family table. It is the most time-intensive part of creating decision models, but it's much shorter than translating into a particular grammar or free-form text and all those kinds of things. The data-centric models are gone, so we don't even have number 2 happening. Estimations for creating decision models are based on solid algorithms, because the model has a look and feel. Completeness is easy to see in a visual diagram. Number 5, the process models, as you saw, became much simplified. Number 6, decisions really gain management attention, especially important decisions. Number 7, most decision models are completed not only prior to design, but sometimes even prior to requirements, which sounds very strange. But sometimes the decisions are so important in the process or the system that organizations will develop the decision models first. And once they have the decision models, put together a plan for automating them, a development plan. So that happens once in a while. The target BRMS, if you're using one of the commercial BRMSs, is merely the execution platform. It's no longer where the logic is changed and governed in business-friendly, technology-independent form. They are managed and changed in decision models and deployed to the target BRMS. So it's no longer lost to the business, and maybe equally important, it's no longer dependent on a particular automation vendor anymore. So you can change vendors more easily. And then finally, the gap between business and IT shrinks in a very comfortable way. So to sum up, some of you are probably asking at this point, is this real? Is this actually happening? And what kind of productivity is possible and has been proven? So we put the time to put together this page. The top bar represents the steps that you are probably carrying out in your business rules approaches, although the top bar doesn't even include the data-centric model, so you have to add that back in there. But basically you read the source, you translate into grammar, you group things, you manually look for errors, you create test cases, and then someone creates the executable code, and then you test it, and then IT development creates production code. And that takes approximately 50 rules, can be done in 6 weeks. If the only thing you do is replace the second 2 tasks, the translation and the grouping, by creating decision models, even in Excel and Visio, you will be able to do 80 rules in 4 weeks, almost twice as many in less time. If you actually go with the business decision management system, we have the all orange there because the BDMS automates a lot of things. Sapiens Decision will parse documents looking for your conditions and conclusions. You create the decision model yourself in there, but it will automatically find all your errors. It will automatically generate test cases. It will automatically allow you to test those test cases internally. You don't need to deploy it to an external platform. It will automatically let you run the tests and compare the results for you to what you expected. And then it will automatically generate production code if you're using one of those adapters. So you can do 160 rules in 3 weeks compared to what you're probably doing today, which is 50 rules in 6 weeks. And not only that, the 160 rules are absolutely error-free. They've been tested, and all the logic issues are gone, where that's not necessarily totally always the case when you do things manually. So the decision model, I hope I've convinced you, is not just another flavor of business rules approach. It is designed deliberately to break the boundaries of existing business rules approaches without sacrificing benefits. And it signals, we believe, not only a new generation of methodology and governance opportunities, but future automation technology. So I hope that you found this interesting. I hope there was something in this presentation that was intriguing to you. If so, I would like to invite you to learn more. And essentially, I will just right now just talk to you about, go to our website and download white papers. Our website is www.kpiusa.com. We have white papers up there. We have a primer up there. We have free Visio templates and Excel templates for rule families and decision model diagrams. And we also have announcements as to where we'll be speaking and about our training programs. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you for joining me.